Welcome to Week 7, Part 2. We're continuing our discussion of the liberal and socialist and fascist revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries. We're beginning with a quote by Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller. He said, "First they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Germany, after World War II. The Weimar Republic was created in 1919, but proved unable to handle the war reparations, and the German economy collapsed. A period of hyperinflation ensued, the kind of inflation that none of us have ever really seen before. Let me give you an example. In 1914, the exchange rate of the German mark to the US dollar was 4.2 German marks to 1 US dollar. 9 years later, by November 1923, the exchange rate was, no kidding, 4.2 trillion marks to $1. The economy was collapsing worldwide as well. The Great Depression began in October 1929 in the United States. Herbert Hoover was president at the time and did not believe that the government should get too involved in the economy. There were some public works programs to help the poor. Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, FDR, in 1933. He inaugurated the New Deal, which eventually included the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, later renamed the Works Projects Administration, and of course Social Security, which we still have with us today. The Great Depression spread worldwide and helped to fuel totalitarianism. The first thing we need to do is to define totalitarianism. I think the best definition I've ever been able to come up with is one from the Oxford Companion to Politics. It says that totalitarian states, quote, were politically and economically highly centralized, very anti-liberal, highly controlling, and invasive in their attitude towards their own citizens, and militaristic. What's the difference between totalitarianism and what we've already looked at in this class, absolutism or authoritarianism? Another scholar, McKay, offers that, those kinds of absolutist powers, quote, were limited in their power and their objectives. They had neither the ability nor the desire to control many aspects of their subjects' lives, end quote. Totalitarianism was the complete antithesis, the opposite of classical liberalism. We started this week out in part 1 of this lecture to look at how liberalism had sought to increase the individual's rights to life, liberty, and property, and to protect them against the state. Well, a good example of totalitarianism would have been the Soviet Union, where Joseph Stalin collectivized agriculture, and as we already said, that resulted in the death of as many as 10 million people. He also participated in great purges of the 1930s against those who disagreed with him. At least 8 million people were arrested, and of these, millions were executed or died in prisons or war camps. Let's get some terminology down. The First Reich in Germany was the Holy Roman Empire, which Voltaire, the wag that he was, said was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, and he was right on all three accounts. Then there was the Second Reich, Bismarck's Germany, which, if you recall, Bismarck, at the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, basically shoved France's nose in the establishment of the Second Reich by announcing it at the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles in Paris, France. The Third Reich, of course, was Hitler's Germany. So let's now turn to Hitler's Germany and to fascism in general. And fascism would include Hitler's Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy, and Francisco Franco's Spain. In 1922, Benito Mussolini seized power in Italy, and his definition of fascism is perhaps the best. It is, quote, everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state, end quote. Fascism was intensely anti-communist, anti-socialist. So we began talking about, utopian socialism and so forth this week. Now we're seeing the antithesis of that in fascism. And fascism was very controlling of people's lives. Now, of course, Italy never became quite the totalitarian state in the same sense as the Soviet Union or Germany. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. This is one of the precursors of World War II. Manchuria was a part of China, but Japan had very few natural resources, and it was looking to expand its industrialization and to search for natural resources. Manchuria was rich in oil and other things, and it had many railroads as well. So Japan invaded a part of China in 1931, and that was a precursor to World War II. In 1933, Hitler came to power in Germany. Hitler had blamed World War I on the Jewish bankers and businessmen. He was taking advantage, ugly advantage, of a centuries-old anti-Semitism in Germany. Remember in week 1, we talked about how leaders can sometimes manipulate people and expand their own followings by finding scapegoats, by determining that failures were not their failures or they were the failures of someone else, finding a common enemy. And this is exactly what Hitler did. In 1935, Mussolini of Italy surprised the world by invading Ethiopia. Remember, it was one of only 2 independent nations at that time existing in Africa. Italy and Germany that same year entered an alliance as the Axis powers. In 1936, amidst civil war in Spain, the Falangists of Francisco Franco staged a revolt, and Franco was supported by Hitler and Mussolini. In 1936, Germany moved into the Rhineland and remilitarized it. This is significant because if you recall in the first part of this lecture that at Versailles, ending World War I, the treaty had said that the Rhineland was to be demilitarized for up to 30 years. And so Hitler is totally disregarding that part of the treaty and moving into the Rhineland and remilitarizing it. 2 years later, he is disregarding other treaties ending World War I when he declares an Anschluss, that is literally a merger, unity with Austria, and German troops march into Austria. You've all, of course, seen movies like The Sound of Music, which depict Baron von Trapp and a couple of other people here and there opposing this Anschluss with Austria. But to be quite honest, many Austrians supported this Anschluss, this unity, this merger with Germany. In 1938, seeking to expand Germany even further, Hitler wanted the Sudetenland, which was an area of German-speaking people, so that is ethnic Germans, who lived in the new country of Czechoslovakia. Remember, Czechoslovakia was one of the nations carved out of Europe at Versailles, ending the World War I. Well, the British and French thought we better sit down and talk about this. They did so at the Munich conference, and they decided to allow, thinking that this would satiate and satisfy finally Hitler, they allowed him to take the Sudetenland. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, returned to Great Britain and was quoted in newspapers as, we have achieved peace in our time. Those are words that I'm certain he wished that he had never said. In 1939, not satisfied only with the Sudetenland, Hitler occupied the remaining areas of Czechoslovakia and signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Now remember, the fascists like Hitler hated communism, so this was just a pact of convenience for the time period. Obviously, he would turn on the Soviet Union here quite soon. Now, despite all the precursors leading up to World War II, the official kind of beginning of World War II is seen as September 1st of 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland. 2 days later, on September 3rd, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. Germany was using Blitzkrieg, lightning war, clearly overrunning the Polish in 4 weeks. In 1939, Hitler continues not only invading Poland, but the Soviet Union overran at the same time Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Now you remember, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania were countries created at Versailles at the end of World War I. So the Soviet Union is taking them over, and then it moved into Finland. In 1940, a great leader, Winston Churchill, became Prime Minister of Great Britain. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, swept across the Netherlands and Belgium, and finally France, while Italy invaded France from the south. France fell on June 22nd. The next day, French General Charles de Gaulle established a government in exile in London, and meanwhile, the Vichy government of France, led by French General Marshal Pétain, collaborated with Germany. In 1940, Germany began the Battle of Britain, sending airplanes to attack, first of all, military and industrial targets, but by September, civilian ones as well, including in the Blitz, British cities like London at night. Hitler would turn his back on the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, and Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, not a particularly smart move on his part. Nazi submarines began a campaign against American ships, and on December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto of the Japanese fleet was reluctant initially to do so and tried to talk Japanese high command out of it. Yamamoto had studied in the United States, and he knew the United States had great natural resources and it was a large industrial and military power. He said it would be awakening a sleeping giant. The Japanese hope was to just kind of knock the Pacific Fleet out of the United States and to either slow them down or perhaps bring them to the negotiation tables. The United States, however, was not to negotiate. The next day, as FDR declared that the attack on Pearl Harbor was an attack that would live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan, and of course, by December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war against the U.S., and the U.S. declared war against them. The entry of the United States, a military and industrial power, into the war on the side of the Allied powers certainly was turning things in favor of the Allies already by 1942 and 43. The Allies achieved a major victory at El Alamein in North Africa in October of 1942, and the Germans suffered a major loss at Stalingrad in the Soviet Union. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met at Casablanca in January of 1943 in North Africa, deciding upon the next steps of this European war, an invasion of Sicily and subsequent invasions of the Italian peninsula, so that finally Italy would fall in 1944. On June 6 of 1944, the largest amphibian invasion in history occurred, as 4,000 Allied vessels and 1 million men landed on the beaches of Normandy and retook, by August, Paris. In December, there was a significant Allied victory at the Battle of the Bulge. Talking too fast. In 1945, at Yalta in the Crimea, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin decided that the U.S., Britain, France, and the Soviet Union would each control their own zones of occupation in Germany after the war, to be determined by the position of the troops at the time when the war would end. This would be significant because, as we'll see in the lecture for week 8, this meant that a whole host of countries became communist, the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Bloc, and of course would be very important in the ensuing Cold War between the Soviet Union and its allies, and the United States and its allies. All three, too, agreed to a new organization, the United Nations, which would be an organization dedicated to collective security, not to this whole idea of achieving a balance of powers. So it hopefully would have more teeth than the League of Nations. Now, already the war had been turning in the Pacific. It had been doing so since the mid-1940s with Midway and other battles, but by 1945 we want to mention the Battle of Iwo Jima. A tiny volcanic island 750 miles from Tokyo, the U.S. Marines lost 20,000 men but were victorious at Iwo Jima. It would be the bloodiest battle in the history of the U.S. Marine Corps. As the war in Europe continued to deteriorate for Hitler and Germany, on April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. On May 8th, 1945, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, Germany surrendered. And the Nuremberg trials against those who had committed atrocities began in November. Having died, FDR was succeeded by U.S. President Harry Truman, who met with Allied leaders at Potsdam in Germany. And at Potsdam, the Allies issued an ultimatum to Japan, demanding that they surrender by August 3rd or, quote, face utter destruction, end quote. The Japanese did not meet that ultimatum, so on August 6th of 1945, an American B-29, the Enola Gay, dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Between 80,000 and 200,000 people died. Still, the Japanese refused to surrender, so on August 9th, the U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on Nagasaki. On September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri, the Japanese agreed to unconditional surrender. If you've ever been to Hawaii or you ever go to Hawaii, please do yourself a favor and go to see the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor. You begin on shore at the little museum and reception center, and then you take a ferry boat out to the actual memorial itself, which sits above the sunken USS Arizona, which still, by the way, is leaking oil. Anyhow, it's a very kind of solemn experience, and one that is very moving. And if you're ever in Japan, I suggest you stop and see the Peace Museum in Hiroshima, Japan. This is what was left of the City Hall of Hiroshima after the bombing, the atomic bomb dropped. Of course, the Japanese have had to shore this up, and they've kept this as a monument in the Peace Museum. There's also a wonderful museum there. Very famous people have visited this Peace Museum and have left quotes. One of those famous persons was Pope John Paul II, who visited there in 1981, and the Japanese loved the quote that he left, and they inscribed it, in fact, on granite at the entrance to the Peace Museum. He said, "War is the work of man. War is destruction of human life. War is death. To remember the past is to commit oneself to the future. To remember Hiroshima is to abhor nuclear war. To remember Hiroshima is to commit oneself to peace." Let's talk a little bit about the Holocaust, which was the Nazi persecution and extermination of Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, and others. Between 1933 and 1939, Jews in Germany were subject to some horrendous things: economic boycotts, arrest, incarceration, the loss of their civil rights, and of course the state-organized Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht literally means crystal night, or the night of broken glass. And on the evenings of November 9th and 10th, the German soldiers destroyed Jewish businesses and synagogues. Clearly, the fight against the Jews would be revving up here shortly. In October of 1939, Hitler ordered T4, a secret euthanasia program, and this was to euthanize deformed children, elderly residents of nursing homes, the physically handicapped, mentally ill people, mentally retarded. Many of these poor individuals, helpless individuals, were gassed at sanatoria. The German public and the Catholic Church found out about it, and they complained. And so Hitler officially, quote, end quote, discontinued the program. But in reality, T4 continued secretly. And instead of gassing their poor victims, they began to give them lethal injections in hospitals and clinics. An estimated 275,000 euthanasia victims died. You know, any civilization can be marked and judged by how it treats those who are less fortunate. And certainly this is a horrible chapter in German history under Hitler. On July 31st of 1941, the final solution on Hitler's orders came about. Quote, "There were to be all necessary preparations for bringing about the complete solution of the Jewish question," end quote. In December, the first extermination camp, Chelmno in Poland, began gassing Jews. In January of 1942, at the Wannsee Conference in Berlin, Hitler's plans for the final solution of the Jews, already underway, were clearly outlined. He hoped to take an estimated 11 million Jews living throughout Europe, to deport them to camps where he hoped they would die either from forced labor or from direct extermination. Germany established 6 major extermination camps in occupied Poland at Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Majdanek, where about half of all victims of the Holocaust died. The aftermath of the Holocaust, about 6 million Jews and 1 million other victims, including homosexuals, gypsies, and Jehovah's Witnesses, died in the Holocaust. So we began this whole lecture and part 1 by saying that, all of these scientific and medical and industrial achievements, people hoped that somehow there would be achievements in the social sphere, that, people would get along with one another and live in peace with one another. And here, a world war occurred, World War II, 60 million soldiers and civilians died, 30 million European refugees. No wonder the first use ever of the atomic bomb. No wonder that after the war, many people would become disillusioned with this idea of progress. Let's turn to China, which is a part of everything that we want to talk about in terms of World War II. And the last time that we left off with China, we saw that there were revolts and civil wars occurring, that it was being carved up by European powers, that the Qing dynasty, which originally came from Manchuria, was seemingly unable to even hold things together. So there were many revolutionary movements in China to establish a republican government. Many of those were led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And I'll let you read my rather detailed article on Dr. Sun Yat-sen just for kind of an overview of all of that. In 1911, there was a revolution in China which resulted in the Qing dynasty. Finally, in 1912, the young Emperor Zhantong abdicated. He would later take the more Western name of Henry Puyi. And as emperor, he lived in the Forbidden City until 1924, although he was really no longer emperor. He kind of thought he was. Actually, outside the Forbidden City walls, China became a republic with the military general Yuan Shikai as president. Now, revolutionaries do not always get along and do not always see eye to eye or have the same objectives, and so such was the case between Sun Yat-sen and Yuan Shikai. There was a break between them, and Sun Yat-sen would go on to lead the Kuomintang, that is the Nationalist Party. And you notice here again that, a typical literate person in China at the college level would know about 50,000 Chinese characters. To take the pronunciation of those and put them in the Roman alphabet into English, there are several different systems, the way Giles and the Pinyin. We're mainly using the Pinyin, so anyhow, Sun Yat-sen became the head of the Kuomintang. And by the way, here, Yuan died in 1916. And after 1916, through the most of the 1920s, there was civil war in China, local warlords in different provinces. Sun Yat-sen died in 1925. Several years later, General Chiang Kai-shek became leader of the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. Then we've already talked about the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 as being a precursor of World War II. And we should note that at that time, they asked the last emperor who had abdicated, the last emperor of China, Henry Puyi, the Japanese asked him to become the emperor of their new province of Manchukuo in Manchuria. And since Henry Puyi was Manchurian and he took the emperorship, he accepted it, and he probably was also hoping that one day he would become emperor again of China. But the poor guy was just a puppet of the Japanese. Now, other people also were involved in the rebellions and civil war in China. The communists certainly hoped to be a part of the plans for a new China. And in 1934, however, the communists were not doing very well. And as a matter of fact, Chiang Kai-shek and his Nationalist Party and their troops were literally chasing the Chinese army and all around China, and led them, on a chase, a 6,000-mile-long march, in fact. Kind of a low point of the Chinese Communist Party, but the Chinese Communist Party began to look at the Long March as a great symbol of solidarity for them as well. By 1937, Japan and China were at war full scale. Awful atrocities were committed by the Japanese in China at Nanjing, where thousands of people were raped and, beaten up and killed. And Japanese also conducted scientific and medical experiments on Chinese, some horrendous things. In 1949, mainland China became the Communist People's Republic of China, with Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party defeating Chiang Kai-shek of the Kuomintang, who then fled to Taiwan. So Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists fled to the island of Taiwan and set up what they said was the real government, a government in exile of China. That was the government that the United States recognized, the government in exile of the Chinese nationalists on the island of Taiwan. The new chairman of the Chinese Communist Party and head of state mainland China was Mao Zedong. This shows you a little map of the area of China, of the areas that were taken over by the Japanese in World War II in this rust color. And that, of course, shows Manchuria, which we've been talking about. Now, since 1949, we're going to discuss a few things in China. There was a rapprochement between the Soviet Union and China for about 10 years between 1950 and 1960. This Sino-Soviet alliance, both of them were communist powers, both were pursuing collectivization of lands, taking over private property and making it state property, etc. It would be a rapprochement. The Sino-Soviet alliance would really break up in 1960 and split up over border disputes between the two. And in an interesting move, in 1958, China pursued the Great Leap Forward, which reminds us of how we started out part one of this lecture, talking about utopian socialists that wanted to build phalansteries, these communal living arrangements. And essentially during the Great Leap Forward, that's what China did. It built communal living arrangements in both the cities and in the countryside. And these communal arrangements would have their own, workplaces, factories, their own school, their own hospital, their own daycare facilities, their own mess hall. They would care for the aged. They would even provide their own entertainment. Now, you would think that this would be a great success, but it wasn't, because obviously people felt like they were being watched by the officials, and certainly that was the case. Now, if we look at the next thing here, 1966-69, well, China became communist in 1949, so as we're approaching 1969, we were approaching the 20th anniversary of that fact. Many of the older leaders from the revolutionary days feared that the younger generation had not experienced the revolution and could not really identify much with it. So this cultural revolution was an attempt by the older revolutionaries to instill revolutionary fervor in the younger generation. How do you do that? Again, you find some enemies. You find some scapegoats. You get people riled up about it. They got them riled up, too, about objects, about old Chinese artworks and cultural artifacts and foreign artworks, etc. And many of the beautiful artworks of China were destroyed during this time because they harkened back to the old pre-communist China, and they must be destroyed. They also took out against those kinds of people who they regarded as revisionist, those people they thought were becoming soft on communism. And of course, they picked on a lot of professors at universities who they thought were becoming soft on communism. And some of them they sent off, to the farms among the peasants to work as peasant farmers. They closed down a lot of the universities, which was unfortunate because China really fell backwards in science and technology and other intellectual things during this era. And so they had a lot of young people dress up as Red Guards and, furl the communist flags, hold parades and marches, attack people who were revisionists, slap them around, put dunce caps on them, chant sayings out of the Red Book of Chairman Mao Zedong's sayings, etc. It was all an unfortunate time period, and many books have been written about it in case you're interested in the Cultural Revolution. Well, of course, the United States never did recognize during this time period, it would be later on, Red China, or the People's Republic of China. And so the very frozen relationships between the two began to thaw when U.S. President Richard Nixon visited China in 1972. Things would start to change, too, when Mao Zedong died in 1976, and the new General Secretary of the Communist Party would be Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping emerged as a leader and began to go after some moderate economic reforms. In his own analogy, he would say of these kinds of reforms that were needed, that it was like a cat. It didn't matter if a cat was a black cat or a white cat. It was a good cat as long as it caught mice. So these reforms were seen as being practical. But of course, once you introduce any kinds of reforms, even if they're minor and even if they're economic, it opens the door a little bit and people have aspirations for greater things to happen. Among those who thought that who wanted more reforms and more liberties and more political reforms were young university students who gathered to protest against the regime in 1989 in the major square, in fact the world's largest square, and it's in Beijing, and it's called Tiananmen Square. But the students were surprised because the government wasn't about to say that we're going to go ahead with these kinds of reforms. The government saw this as a revolt, as literally a rebellion. And they quelled the rebellion with a violent response. There's a very famous photo of a student standing in front of a tank very heroically before it ran him down. There's no official count of the dead. Probably hundreds of students were killed. In 1997, Deng Xiaoping died, and Jiang Zemin became president of the Communist Party, General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. In the same year, the United Kingdom returned the colony of Hong Kong to China. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, and by 2002, Hu Jintao became General Secretary of the Communist Party. And in 2012, every 5 years they have a party conference. And so he lasted for 10 years and he stepped down, and Mr. Xi, is now the General Secretary of the Communist Party in China. And as he says, as most other general secretaries have said, we have to be careful that, corruption doesn't occur within the party. We have to look at, the whole situation of how far and how fast we're moving economically. There's certainly a lot of unrest that remains in China, unrest in areas like Tibet, unrest among the poor, unrest among the new middle class, a desire for more political liberties. Any questions, please feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help, and have a good week.